Zvuk Misli.
Podcast Instituta za filozofiju I društvenu teoriju.
Welcome to another episode of The Sound of Thought, a podcast by the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory, University of Belgrade. Our today's guest is Professor Jonathan Wolff, a professor at Oxford University, a political philosopher. Our themes for this conversation included concepts such as equality and justice. We discussed our guest's latest book, City of Equals, and many other topics that are related to the issues of justice and issues of equality. Professor Wolff, welcome to Belgrade. Welcome to our podcast.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be in Belgrade and to be with you on the podcast.
Okay. Let's start with some general notions and discussion about the most classical terms of political philosophy, such as the notion of equality. In your work, you usually distinguish between this equality as distribution or redistribution and the notion of social equality. What does make these two notions different in your view?
Okay. So I'll answer by talking a little bit about my philosophical education and development. So when I was a graduate student in London in the mid-80s, early 80s, my teacher was Jerry Cohen, G.A. Cohen, who is primarily known for his early work on Marx and then later work on equality and distribution and justice. And he ran a seminar where we read Ronald Dworkin's two very long papers on equality. And Dworkin had set the question, if you believe in equality, then equality of what? And to put it simply, equality of money might lead to differences in people's happiness. So if you want to make everyone equally happy, you might have to give them different amounts of money. So this sets a problem. What is fundamental for egalitarians? Should it be well-being? Should it be standard of living? Should it be need? Should it be basic capabilities? Should it be resources, money, income, wealth? And this set a problem that Jerry Cohen later called the currency of egalitarian justice, and has assumed that if you were a political philosopher interested in equality, your job was to answer the question, equality of what? So I thought that should be my work, as I was one of Jerry's students, and this was cutting-edge political philosophy. But my heart was never in it. For some reason, this seemed to me not to have gotten the question right. But it took me a long time to formulate what I thought was wrong with it. And eventually, when I did, I thought to myself, well, before I was an undergraduate, if people had asked me if I was left-wing, I would have said, yes, of course, I'm very left-wing. If they said, did I believe in equality of income, I would have said, what's that got to do with anything? Because I was brought up in a sort of romantic, more socialist, Fabian, Marxist even tradition, where material goods were almost a form of alienation or reification. And the good life is a life that you live in relation to other people, where you fulfill yourself, where you develop your talents. And money, if anything, was a distraction. That you need money, of course, to do these other things, or you need resources if you're in a non-money society. But being on the left didn't seem to me to have much to do with sharing things out equally. And that seemed to me almost childish or fetishistic. So I thought, well, what is it then that attracts me to the idea of equality? And I thought, it's the idea really of not having anyone above me and no one below me, as Bertolt Brecht puts it. So not being in relations of subordination or superiority. So treating other people as equals and being treated by others as equals seems to be much more important than the distribution of goods. So this is then the motivation for the distinction between distributive equality and relational equality, as it's now mostly called. I preferred the term social equality. One of my colleagues explained to me very well why relational equality was a bad name. I now can't remember that reasoning, but it was enough to make me prefer social equality. But relational equality is a term that has stuck from Elizabeth Anderson. and I'm happy with that. But what I should say, though, is that it's not a new idea. So Anderson and myself, Sam Scheffler, formulated different versions of this, Anderson and Scheffler in much more detail than me. But other people were doing this before us, so David Miller, Richard Norman, going back, the socialist philosopher and political scientist and administrator, really, Tawney, R.H. Tawney, on a book on equality written in the 1920s, makes similar points. So I was amazed, actually, to read the book, because when I first read Tawney, I was stuck in the Dworkin currency of egalitarian justice debate. And I read Tawney thinking, well, what's his answer? So he wrote a book called Equality. What does he think should be distributed equally? And what I realized with him is that he's just much more interested in relations of social class to each other and inheritance of privilege over the generations. So he has tables showing how the British High Court judges all went to the same 10 schools or something, and their parents were all lords. So you have this idea of reproduction of class privilege that he's against. And then looking at these contemporary philosophy views, no one mentions social class. I mean, it's quite interesting if you think about John Rawls, for example. The idea of social class just isn't there, partly because they're doing a type of ideal theory, where they're trying to give you an account of what an ideal society would be like.
Does that mean that social class is irrelevant in their view when it comes to the notion of equality?
So I think that's right. So there are all sorts of things that they don't discuss. So the concept of poverty, for example, is not really discussed, because in the ideal world there's no poverty, so there's nothing to discuss. And in the ideal world there'll be no class distinction. Everyone will be on the same level. And that's fine, and I don't think I disagree with that. In an ideal world, there'll be no poverty and no social classes. But I think if you want to make recommendations for changing the world that we're in, you have to start from where we are, which is a different topic, I suppose, of ideal and non-ideal. But just to return to equality, so I quite early on decided to be a critic of some forms of distributive equality. To begin with, I thought you had to be a pluralist, so you should believe in distributive equality and then social equality as well, or relational equality as well. And there will sometimes be a balance that you have to strike, because there can be tensions between distributive equality and social equality. So you have to make some decisions there. At various times, I've become the pendulum has switched more to social equality, and thinking that distributive equality is a good theory of fairness, but fairness isn't very important. It's much more important how we relate to each other. So human relations are much more important than making sure everything is exactly fair. So one way I heard this illustrated, which I adopted, is how people split the bill after a meal in a restaurant. So you can be completely fair and make sure everyone pays exactly what they've had, or you could just split the bill and not worry, and then maybe it is a bit unfair, but you sort of protect human relations. And I've noticed in the United States it's very common for everyone to pay exactly for what they've eaten, whereas in the UK that would be considered very...
The credit cards made that more easier.
Well, that is true, and the waiters seem to be very patient coming around the table and doing it. But of course it can be exploited, because if you have something where you always split the bill and someone drinks expensive drink and has a cigar after the meal, as you might have done in the old days, not now, and exploits the situation, then this idea of we don't fuss about the details can be quite exploitable. So you do have to hit a balance, I think, between this sort of not worrying too much about fairness, but at the same time, if you ignore it completely, you can be in a situation where relationships start to deteriorate because people are exploiting. So there's always this balance between the relations and fairness. But in my work as I went on, I wanted to emphasize the importance of relations more and more. But the difficulty I had, and I stopped working on this for a while because I couldn't make any progress, was to think, well, what are these relations of equality? So we want to live in a society where we have relations of equality. Well, you could say common courtesy, being kind to people, holding doors open for people, not taking the last seat on the bus and giving it to someone else, and these sorts of things. Caring. But that's not a theory on its own, because you can put that on top of any other theory. That's compatible with libertarianism, for example. Or you could try and have a very thick view. So you could say, well, a kibbutz, that's what a society of equals looks like. So there's no private property, you all eat together, you raise your kids together. I thought, well, okay, some people would like that, but I don't want to force that model on everyone. So you have this problem, I thought, this dilemma. Either it's too thick a notion, too perfectionist, too constrictive, or you have something very bland. And I couldn't work out what to do. So I left it. I got a couple of PhD students to try and solve the problem for me. They wrote very good theses on relational equality, but they didn't really solve the problem. You weren't convinced. They had the same problems as me in the end. So I left it. And then what I had been doing in the meantime was a lot of work on philosophy and public policy. And there, I've tended always to start from the problem rather than think, okay, I've got a theory, I can solve all your problems, just tell me your problems. So I worked on the regulation of gambling, regulation of recreational drugs, the law of homicide, animal experimentation. And each case, you start with a rich description of the world and the problem you start with, and then try to apply some sort of philosophical analysis once you've done some sort of empirical investigation first. And then I thought, well, actually, in some of this literature, so David Miller, for example, who's my colleague in Oxford, had written a paper where he said, believers in social equality can say what we're against. So we're against hierarchy, we're against exploitation, we're against marginalization, discrimination, racism. There's a whole load of things we're against. Much harder to say what we're for. So I thought, well, why do we need to say what we're for? Why can't we just start with these unjustified inequalities in the world? Now, if we get all of those sorted out, maybe we then need to have that debate about what equality would be. But I now tend to take the view that there isn't a single idea of social equality. I think there are many different ways that you could have a society of social equals, a society of equals. What they have in common is they don't have exploitation, they don't have violence, they don't have cultural imperialism. So in other words, I now think in terms of giving priority to inequality over equality. And this goes against the grain of a way of thinking, because you normally think the positive has priority over the negative. And how can you understand inequality unless you've got a theory of equality? But that now just seems to me a dogma, because we're very good at detecting ways in which the world goes wrong without necessarily having a theory of what would make it exactly right. So if you take a concept like exploitation, so most of us will use the term exploitation at some point. So we see someone in a restaurant who's washing dishes for very low pay, not enough really to pay their rent. Many of us will say that person's exploited, and other people would agree. But if we were to say, well, what's your theory of exploitation? Or what would be a world without exploitation? Unless you're a Marxist or you believe in perfect free market economics, you don't have a theory of exploitation. But you're perfectly prepared to
That would be
use
exactly my question. How do we develop or how do we settle a solid argument against inequality unless we look at the very structure of the capitalist framework?
Yeah.
Is that what you were having trouble with?
So I don't think. So there's a view which was once upon a time just took for granted, which was to be entitled to say something is wrong, you need a theory of what would be right. And I no longer believe that anymore. So I think our judgments of when things are wrong are prior to a theory of justice, and that different people can agree on the same account of when things are wrong. Different people can agree that this situation is wrong. Now, of course, the problems come if there are more than one way of solving that. And you also want policies that work together rather than apart. So you do need some idea, I think, of a general direction that you're going in. So you need a theory probably of what would be better and worse, and more desirable. And maybe you need elements of an ideal theory in order to plan in the longer term. But I think, first of all, that we can make judgments that something is wrong or unequal or unjust without having a theory of what is right or equal or just. And even when we do need more to tell which direction we're going in, that doesn't have to be a full theory of justice, just an account of what is better. So Amartya Sen tries to develop this theory in more detail. So he says that we can say one mountain is higher than another without having a theory of what the highest mountain would be. Now that's very contested. It might not be a very good analogy, but this is the thought that we can say something is better than something else without knowing what would be best. And so that's really what I've been trying to convince other people from.
But taking, you mentioned John Rawls and his famous classical, let's say, theory of the question that pops up sometimes is how much inequality can be justified. And then there is his famous proclamation about the whale of ignorance, about people not knowing which class are they going to belong, and then judging from that perspective behind the whale of ignorance about how much inequality would be just enough for a just society. And then his argument that inequality that works at the benefit of the bottom is the kind of inequality that can be justified. Where do you stand with respect to this argument?
So it's a beautiful argument. It's a beautiful idea. And although I have disagreements with Rawls, I think he left out too many topics. So issues around gender and immigration and race and health and so on. So he's left out what for me are probably the most important topics in political philosophy. But if we're thinking just about economic distribution, the idea that we should make the worst off as well off as possible is, I think, a superb ideal theory. Because what is the alternative? You're making everyone worse off. So you might think society should be completely equal. Rawls says fine, but you might be punishing the worst off by doing that. And do you really want to do that? In terms of the practicalities of Rawls's theory, it's very demanding, and it's demanding in at least two ways. So one is it's politically very demanding. So no society has ever come close to a Rawlsian society. I mean, no society has made the worst off as well off as possible. So even the most egalitarian welfare capitalist societies, so the Scandinavian countries, even though they do have a lot of concern for the worst off, they haven't made the worst off as well off as possible. Taxes could go higher, redistribution could go higher, investment in education could be even higher, even though it's very good. So no one has achieved the Rawlsian society, but also it's epistemologically very demanding. So how do you know that you've made the worst off as well off as possible?
Can one calculate that?
Exactly. I mean, you know how well off they are, but how do you know the counterfactual of how well off they could be? So for practical purposes, I prefer an idea that I first heard about when I was making a radio program for the BBC on the foundation of the National Health Service, the NHS. And this came in the 1940s when we had a new Labour government, or the first Labour government after the war, after the Second World War. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for welfare state and for nationalisation of industry. But the Labour government at that time were very worried about being labelled a Marxist government or too far left. And business was worried. And they said, I heard a number of Labour politicians say, inequality is acceptable, but only if it works for everyone. And this is like the very general Rawlsian idea. This was before Rawls. So later on, Rawls, one of the British reviewers of Rawls said Rawls has formulated the principles of the British Labour Party. And I think this is what he had in mind. That was Stuart Hampshire. This idea that, yes, we don't really have an alternative to capitalism. To that degree, neoliberalism is correct. We need markets, we need market signals, we need incentives, we need all of that. But we can have that in many, many different forms. And so you could have the type of very aggressive capitalism that we're seeing more and more, where firms can come in and asset strip and make thousands of people unemployed just to raise profits a little more. But from the point of view of this Labour Party idea in the 1940s, that would have been completely unacceptable, because that's an inequality that harms people. But if you can show how by you getting richer, you're also bringing other people with you, or you're creating more opportunities, creating better jobs, creating better environment, and that's something that goes alongside with you getting rich. I personally have much less problem with that. Like many utopians, I'd rather people just did it without wanting to get rich. Mm-hmm. But I think that that's unrealistic from the point of view of at least how we've been socialized and how we're going to be for the next 100 years or the rest of time, maybe. So, but I do think this is a good compromise. That yes, you can get rich, but only if you bring the rest of society with you. Mm-hmm. Now, this is very similar to an idea that you used to hear a lot in America.
But isn't that a bit... what's the difference between that argument and the trickle-down logic?
Well, that's exactly my point, that the trickle-down argument is the confidence that will happen through unregulated capitalism. But my position is that it won't happen through unregulated capitalism. So in unregulated capitalism, a rising tide floods small boats, right?
So instead of an invisible hand, we need a visible hand.
I mean, it's very convenient for people on the right to run different things together. So it came up in the conference earlier today, in conversation, where I was talking about people running together free competition and a laissez-faire economy. Because I think in the minds of many people, they're the same thing, but they're completely different. Because the laissez-faire economy says you don't regulate, but to have fair, free competition, you need someone to make sure that competition actually happens, to prevent monopolies and prevent mergers and oligarchies.
Even the free market economy is also regulated.
It's heavily regulated.
There must be some laws that protect private property, that protect...
Well, that is true. That is true. But they need laws to protect competition. Mm-hmm. So we have European competition laws. And even in America, they've got laws trying to make sure that monopolies don't form. So if two big companies in the same industry want to merge, they have trouble doing it because it gives them too much market power. So laissez-faire and free competition are not the same thing. And I'm not even saying there should be free competition. I think there should be limits on competition. But I think there should be, and how we do it, I don't know. But there should be forms of scrutiny of economic activity that get rid of, the term extractive capitalism has come up a lot now, or like scavenger firms who just see where there's an opportunity to make money in the short term and come in. So one of the things that is often done is a company is taken over and then laden with debt, and people are taking profits out funded by debt, and then the company goes bankrupt, and the creditors lose, and the ordinary employers lose, and the customers lose. But the only people who win are the people who bought the company in the first place, and came out often with many hundreds of millions because they bankrupted the companies that they've bought. So that, how you do it, I don't know. But that would be the sort of practice that would stop if we could really have this idea that inequalities can only be justified if they're to social benefit.
But how do you stand related to that with respect to the merit argument? When we're talking about free competition of free agents, individuals or groups of people, whose competition is based on some form of fairness or justice. And then also we can include the concept of equality of opportunities. How do you secure real equality of opportunities? If we, I mean, in this conversation we put aside the Marxian perspective, which is I mean, all these issues could be an easy target for a Marxian perspective. But again, if we are fully aware in what kind of world we're living in, and if we observe the reality through the lenses of policy, what should we do really? Then we might still stick to this framework. So, what about equality of opportunities, and what about measuring one's merit?
Yeah. Okay, so it's a fascinating question, and I would start, I suppose, with my puzzlement really about the attraction of people on the left to the idea of equality of opportunity. Because when people talk about equality of opportunity, what they want is if you think of life as a race, a running race, say a competition, they want to make the competition as fair as possible. So if you think about a running race, you want everyone to start on the same line. You want everyone to have the same type of shoes. You want everyone to be able to run a clear thing. So the idea of equality of opportunity is or
everyone to run the same distance.
Well, so that yes, okay. So you've got to run the same distance to win the race. That is all true. But the peculiar thing about that is that it presupposes a competition model of society. And so there's a question of why should people on the left start from the idea of competition? And so I've been very influenced by the philosopher Janet Radcliffe Richards, who wrote a paper about two different ways of thinking about opportunity. And the economist Tony Atkinson has made the same argument. He's given a simpler example. So I'll give Atkinson's example, even though I got the idea from Janet Radcliffe Richards. So when I was growing up, we all had swimming lessons at school. And you got to a certain point where you could go in for your green badge, which was, I think you had to jump in the deep end in your pajamas, get a brick from the bottom of the pool, and then swim a length or something. And if you did that, you got a green badge. And there was no limit to the number of green badges that were available. So you just had to hit that threshold, a bit like a driving license. So a driving license, you show you can drive, then you get this reward, and it's valuable. So a driving license allows you to do other things. Green badge allowed you to swim that other side of the ropes, unsupervised something, because you proved you could do something. So Atkinson says, contrast the green badge for swimming with winning a race. So equality of opportunities, as it's traditionally thought, is like having a race with a limited number of prizes, and only a small number of people can win, or one person can win. So we want to make it as fair as possible. Green badge, okay, you don't want people cheating, but you're not obsessed with making sure everyone starts on the same day or in the same weather. Sometimes it could be more difficult because it's cold outside or something. It doesn't really matter. And so Atkinson and Radcliffe Richards say one conception of equality is this competitive notion, and the other is this idea of having sort of rich opportunities in life. So if you think about your children and the type of how and opportunities in relation to your children, you might think, well, I want my children to have these opportunities so they can compete well in the race of life, so they'll get the best jobs or best prizes. Or you could say, well, I want my children to sample drama and sports and poetry and classical music or pop music. I want them to try all these things. So they have all these different types of opportunities in life.
So are you talking about the proliferation of the fields in which one can achieve self-fulfillment?
Well, I'm just saying that if you're talking about opportunity, you can talk about it in a competitive way and in a non-competitive way.
Call it cooperative or...
Well, it doesn't even have to be cooperative. Mm-hmm. It just means it's not rival. Mm-hmm. That if I can play the piano and enjoy it and you play the piano, we're not cooperating. Mm-hmm. But that's different from going into the piano competition.
Yeah.
And you might want to raise your kids so they win the piano competition or get the solo spot on stage. Or you might want to raise your kids so they just enjoy playing music.
So without without equalizing winning with joy or self-fulfillment.
Right. So there isn't a winning, there's self-fulfillment.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I think that idea is much more appropriate to left-wing thought. That we all want to create a world in which everyone can fulfill themselves in their own way, rather than having a fair competition for a few scarce prizes.
Yeah, but what if some kids want to play piano and they cannot afford it?
Well, then they don't have the opportunity. So then a part of the left idea is that everyone who has a talent should have the opportunity to develop it. When Rawls does this, I think he almost says that, but he does it in terms of everyone should have the opportunity to compete for prizes, for scarce positions. I want to say no, people should have the opportunity to do things to develop themselves for their own fulfillment. Now, of course, there will be prizes, and as long as we've got a competitive economy, there will be places, and it is much better if we have equality of opportunity in that competitive sense than having privilege or nepotism. So I think in the world as it is, we do need to have fair competition. So we need to eliminate class privilege or family privilege. But I don't think that's the end of it.
May I ask what makes such view, which is indeed based on fairness, on even on some let's say social justice or social equality, what makes this position less utopian than a classical Marxian classless society?
Okay, so
or I mean, being utopian is not necessarily a bad thing, right? But I'm wondering if you think this is less utopian and why.
So the classless society is a wonderful idea, and I would definitely back that. And utopia, as you say, not foolish or not always foolish. But the classless society, I may be wrong about this, but it feels to me something that is all or nothing. That either you have a classless society or you have a society with social classes. Okay, social classes can be more important, less important. So if you have a caste system like in India, then classes are much more important than if you don't have formal rules. But in the UK, we have very much a class-based system still. Social class isn't as important as it was, say, 50 years ago, but you still see it. And it goes with accent and the way people dress and who's taken seriously and who's not taken seriously. What I'm suggesting is that we think about opportunity in this broad sense of individuals having opportunities for flourishing rather than individuals having opportunities to compete in a race, although they also do need to compete in the race sometimes. But I don't think that should be our sole focus. We should also think about opportunities, and it is something we can work towards, so we can have a situation where more people have those opportunities. So, for example, one thing in the UK that has been discussed a lot is musical education in schools. So once upon a time, if you had a talent for an instrument and you were in a state school, then you would get free lessons. And they would see if you really have an amazing talent, then you get a scholarship and so on. So whatever your background is, so you have people from completely modest backgrounds, alongside wealthy people as well, of course, playing in orchestras, playing in classical orchestras. So I knew some very down-to-earth people who were lead horn player in symphony orchestras, and I would drink with them at the weekends, and you would have no idea they weren't farmers, but then they'd go off and for the week and play horn rather than milking the cows. So you have people from very modest backgrounds who could get into orchestras because of the school music programs. Those have been cut to some degree, and so now your musical education is much more associated with private schools, and probably the composition of orchestras, social composition of orchestras, is changing as well. I don't know that for sure. So I think that there are things we can do to make things more or less. Sport is another example. And one thing has been...
Yeah, that's a good example of sports. I noticed recently in Vienna, Austria is not that well-known country for the greatest sport achievements if we exclude snow sports and icy sports. But then what I noticed in Vienna, for instance, is that they have much more basketball courts, tennis courts, courts for volleyball, whereas Serbia, the country where we are now, is really doing hard to compete and play at the highest level in all those sports, especially basketball, tennis. But then I think that Vienna alone has much more sport courts for recreation than Serbia does. So does that make sense? So that there are some fields in which you shouldn't compete, you should just enjoy.
Well, sport is an interesting thing, of course, because you have both there. You have people who are competing at the highest level, and Serbia is not doing too bad in tennis in that respect, for example.
Isn't that the obsession of countries that are, let's say, less developed economically?
I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at the leading tennis players,
it matters more.
That in women's tennis, for example, after the Williams sisters retired, I don't think there's been an American of achieving at the highest level. Australian, Polish, a lot of Russian women. And so it seems to be that tennis is a middle income country sport. And I think it is, sport is still a way in which people have extreme social mobility, that you can be born at any level, and then if you have an extreme talent, then there's a way of monetizing it. But so the UK is interesting in this respect. I'm not sure about tennis, but in the Olympic Games, apart from the jibe that an Australian told me that the British can only compete in sports you do sitting down, like bicycle, rowing, cycling. There are a few others that you do with minimum movement, maybe shooting. These are expensive sports. Horse riding is another. So you have to be from a wealthy background even to try them out. And what we find is that most of the Olympic athletes that we have are people who are educated in private schools. And that's only about 10% of the population. So from that 10%, they're the people who are having these rich opportunities. So, the thought is not they're more talented. Who knows whether they're more talented? There's no reason why they should be. But from an early age, if they showed any talent, there was someone there who was going to help them develop. And the same for actors. Of course, these are expensive things. You probably need some family wealth to take the risk. Same for writers. So a lot of the opportunities that the upper middle classes have, I would want to just see extended through society as a whole. Not necessarily for the competitive element, but to allow people to have more sources of fulfillment in their lives. I don't want to say people, only middle class people have fulfilled lives, and
But it's more likely that someone with a backup plan in material terms will give it a try and take a risk of becoming a novelist or a poet or an unsuccessful sportsman.
So that's right. So that's been very important to me in my work, thinking about the consequences of failure, having a life plan and the consequences of failure. So when I was a graduate, early years, postgraduate, so I come from a ordinary family, not a poor family, but not a wealthy family. And I saw people graduating who went off to write their novels or become a play critic. And I thought, what an adventurous, daring thing to do. I'm far too conservative. I'm not a risk taker. And then later on, I found most of these people were just from very wealthy families. So they weren't taking a risk at all. They were just doing what they thought they could do. And for some people it worked, for some people it didn't work. And no, of course, there were people from more modest backgrounds who were taking a risk. but for them it really was a risk. So what looks like risky behavior. So I thought that we often talk about families being comfortably off, and I like that metaphor because what it means is you can take a bit of a risk, and if you fall, you'll fall into these nice cushions. You'll have a comfortable landing place. Whereas for other people, maybe they don't. And so it's very difficult to encourage people to take risks if they will be very badly off if the risks don't work out for them.
Mm-hmm. You write quite a lot and extensively about the society in which there are some fields, and this is what some other authors write about, that certain fields or segments of society should not be objectified for the sake of profit accumulation. And that kind of standing goes directly against what is a dominant ideological mantra in the neoliberal world, and especially it goes against the logic of capital as such, that expands in order to create more sources and possibilities for further accumulation and rise of the profit rate. How do you, and precisely some states in which capitalist states with a well-developed welfare model indeed leave certain sectors of society like public transport, healthcare, education out of reach of the capital logic. How do we reach this level, but not only in separate countries of Scandinavia or some Western European countries, and make it a rather international or transnational idea that is indeed possible?
So how do we get a safety net everywhere in the world? Is that the question?
Under the framework of global capitalism.
Yeah. So we have the countries of sort of Northwest Europe, maybe Southwest Europe as well, where there are quite extensive forms of social safety nets now. But even in those countries, there's poverty. There are people who are homeless. But the numbers they can be going up, but they're pretty manageable. That's not to deny that many people in those countries have a very hard life. But there are things in the United States, for example, where there's the concept of medical bankruptcy. And I saw some figures that said 1 million Americans every year declare medical bankruptcy. Well, this is something that is almost unheard of anywhere else in the world. You have at the moment a huge homelessness problem in the United States. You have the opioid crisis. You've got what Case and Dayton have called deaths of despair. And so for white Americans, non-Hispanic white Americans, life expectancy is going down now. And this is the first time for probably in recorded history, the life expectancy is falling. And this in the richest country in the world. So it seems scandalous.
There was a similar trend in the post-Soviet Russia, if I'm not mistaken.
You're absolutely right. I mean, that was an amazing thing. Yeah,
and it was a significant fall.
Well, you're right. So it was a much bigger fall, and it was, I believe, that life expectancy for men fell by 10 years in Russia. So post-Soviet Russia, women about 3 or 4 years, but still they fell. And that's, I mean, it is fascinating. I think it was the best account of this I've heard is from Michael Marmot, the social epidemiologist, who's very interested in inequality. And he says that it was a shock of unemployment that was so problematic. It's more problematic for men than women, because women have typically gone in and out of work through periods of their life. So they had children, or they've changed jobs, or done part-time work. But in Russia at that time, men would have a job for life, and they would form their social network around their work and their wife. Whereas women form a social network in any way they want. So women have a network with their mother and sisters and their cousins and people they used to work with and people they met in the street and they're still talking to 20 years later. Men typically don't do that. So men form their social networks around their work and around their wives.
That's why it hit them in a harsher way.
Exactly. And then they became unbearable at home and got kicked out of their home. So then they lost their other social network and started drinking.
Safety net.
Yeah, they lost their own social safety net. So they started living with other men in the same condition and drinking and fighting to early death. So pretty disastrous. The US situation is not a shock in that same way because it's been a more gradual change. But deaths of despair are people who just see no way of making a good life for themselves and take to drink and drugs and violence in the same way. So you're right that I was wrong to say that the fall in life expectancy was unparalleled. It was worse in Russia. But I think if you restrict it to the United States, I don't think there had been a fall there. Life expectancy is stalling elsewhere. So I think in the UK it may be stagnant rather than rising. COVID, of course, has affected the figure, so we're not really sure what the longer term trend will be. And you see just different projections. You just don't know what's going to happen. But people have said, this is either the rising generation are going to be the first generation where it's normal to live to 100, or they're going to be the first generation that don't live as long as their parents. And we don't know which of those two futures we're heading for. So I thought a lot about individualism and social provision, particularly around healthcare, because if you look at the United States, it just looks crazy from the point of view of the rest of the OECD. And any country that can afford it has some form of universal healthcare now. It might be through insurance, but it's always backed up by the state. The US, despite all the reforms, there are people, not the poorest, because the poorest have state-provided Medicaid, I think it is, and then for elderly people they have Medicare, a lot of people on veterans assistance. So there is a huge state-funded healthcare system in the US, bigger than most countries in terms of GDP. But what we focus on is the insurance scheme. And there are lots of people who still are uncovered because they don't fall into the state-funded categories and they haven't bought insurance, even though they have lots of financial incentives to do that now. So what do I think about that? So do I think it's absolutely wrong? Well, I need to take a step back a bit, I think, because a society could value individualism to such a point where they want everything to be on the market. And if you had a background of a fair society, then everyone wanted to be able to make their own decisions. I might say, well, you're very foolish, but if that's your choice, if that is the genuine choice of the great majority of your society, and you're happy with that, now I don't think it's for philosophers to tell you you're wrong. But that isn't the situation. The situation is where they've drifted into this crazy scheme, which is incredibly administratively top-heavy, costs an absolute fortune to administer. It's not a fair background society to begin with. So I think it doesn't live up to the ideology of free, simple, individualist society. So I wouldn't say that you have to have universal healthcare. In an ideal world, you might have a fully private system. I think you'd be mad. Well, mad is a bit strong, but I think you'd be foolish to do it. But that's a choice. If the people make it, I think that should be a democratic choice for them. But the US is so far away from that. Now, if you're talking now to middle-income countries do generally have good health systems now. I'm not sure how it's done, but modern medicine is everywhere, particularly in middle-income countries. Okay, low-income countries can't do it, but it has been a priority, and training of doctors and nurses is very good, and hospitals are very good, particularly in the cities. Maybe in the rural areas it's tougher, and then there are going to be groups who are not covered, so people in poverty or maybe some minorities might fall outside the system, depending on the different country. But I think the social safety net of other forms of welfare just isn't there yet. And does it need to be? So
is it more likely that such social safety networks can be developed in at the level of cities? Since you discussed this in your in the book you co-authored, City of Equals, that cities can actually be the units, even if you will, the units of our analysis, or the units of our policy suggestions or policy applications, where we could actually, if the national level, let alone global level, is for now, the global justice is seems to be like a dream at this point. Can we focus, or should we focus, on cities and how that equality or justice at the municipal level, and whether and I was also wondering about your stance on municipalism as a field or a approach to the struggle for more equality.
Yeah. So thank you. Yes, so I have recently published a book called City of Equals with Avner Dishalit, which is our second book together. Very enjoyable process of putting it together. So we don't think that cities are the answer to everything, because only half the world's population lives in them. And we haven't written a book about rural justice. And arguably some of the biggest problems are outside the cities. And we acknowledge that. We don't think this is a complete theory of justice. But we were struck, and Avner has done work on the city before this. This is the first work I've done on the city. But he's pointed out in other work that philosophers have tended not to talk about the city. So when we talk about justice, we're thinking about justice within a country or global justice.
And you're one of the rare philosophers who did empirical research.
A little bit of empirical work, yeah. And that's true, some original empirical work we've done, yeah. So what has happened in this book was that Avner was looking at a list of the most unequal American cities. And he saw Berkeley, California, as I think number 10 as the most unequal city in the US.
In terms of income? Or
it was just a table of inequality. It didn't explain why, right?
There were no parameters.
Well, when you look a bit more carefully, it says income inequality.
Okay.
And you can say, yes, okay, Berkeley is very unequal in terms of income. There are multimillionaires. We're not sure if there are any billionaires, but there are certainly people who've got hundreds of millions living there, and many, many people who are poor and homeless. But at the same time, it's the city that people on the left in the US want to live in.
A bunch of cooperatives. And
so there's something about it that makes it feel equal.
Rebellious university.
Could be the rebellious university, or that could be a symptom of something else.
Yeah.
But this is a basic conundrum. If we think Berkeley embodies some notion of equality, it's not equality of income. So what is it if it's not equality of income? So that set us off thinking. And we also thought that income actually isn't under the control of the city anyway. The city, very few cities can set taxes. If they do, it's very small things, maybe about housing tax. But cities can't do redistributive justice through progressive income tax, or very, very rarely. So the parameters that they can use are not the standard parameters that are available to the state. So we started thinking, what is it that makes a city of equals? And we reflected on it ourselves. I remember walking along the beach of the Mediterranean for a few days with Avner, having discussions about cities of equals, which seemed a strange place to be doing it, but it was Tel Aviv, which is a city. And
you did research in 6 countries, 10 cities,
yeah.
180 interviewees.
That's right. Okay. That's what we did. 180 interviews, 10 cities, 6 countries. Very well remembered.
And what was your approach? How did you choose? Did you choose a random people on the street asking questions?
Yeah. So so the cities we chose by convenience, really, because we had I don't do this work. I'm not a good interviewer. Avner does. So he could do interviews in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. He also did New York. But we only wanted to interview people in their native language. So that meant we were restricted with the research assistants we had. So we had a Dutch research assistant and a German research assistant. And also a Brazilian research assistant. So we chose Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Oxford and London, New York, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Berlin, Hamburg, and Rio. So those were our 10 cities. And we stopped people in the street. Now, we know that this is not a scientific methodology. It won't give you a random sample. But I'll explain why we weren't looking particularly for a random sample. But we did interviews at different times of day. So Avner got up early in the morning in New York to interview people on their way to work at 6 o'clock in the morning. We interview people in different parts of the
Those
cities.
must be the lower class people, because rich people don't get up that early.
Well, there are two other things about rich people. So rich bankers do actually get up. So there's a book by Daniel Markovits where he points out probably that for the first time in history, the richer you are, the harder you work. I mean, it's never been true in the past, but now because of bankers and lawyers billing every quarter of an hour, they're working 10-hour, 12-hour days, which in the past the rich would not have done.
It must be a nightmare.
So we've got this. Well, yes. So we've got this paradoxical situation. But rich people wouldn't stop. Well, one, they're in their cars anyway; they're not walking, and two, their time is too valuable, so they wouldn't stop. So we were not talking on the whole to rich people. We didn't talk to many men in their 40s and 50s because they were all in their offices. So it tended to be older people or refugees, or immigrants rather than refugees, ordinary people in the street, mothers. So people with enough time to stop, because we wanted a proper interview with them. Because we weren't trying to get a representative sample, even though we have used it in some ways. So one of the interesting things, for example, almost no one talks about income distribution.
When asked about
equalities,
in the city,
they talked about how they were treated, which is much more the relational idea.
Whether they feel discriminated, whether they are treated with dignity,
and how the city treats them. That was very important. So whether the city takes any notice of them, and whether they have access to city officials
or to public spaces.
Public spaces as well, particularly for mothers with children. And
public transport.
Public transport, really important. Yeah, do the buses come to my area or not? So in Rio,
super
this was
important indeed.
Yeah. So this is, London came out very well for this, because public transport doesn't discriminate in terms of rich and poor, as far as I know. Rio very badly, because the wealthy parts are very well connected. The poorer parts, it's much harder to get into the main city, partly because of the geography.
Yeah, but that happens in the entire countries. I know that if you go to northern Italy, that part is very well connected with fast train system, whereas the south is terribly connected.
And so partly it's geography, because if you've got a lot of mountains, it's very much more expensive. Partly.
Yeah.
But in the rich areas, they just drill through the mountains.
Exactly.
And in the poor parts, they say we can't do anything about it.
If there is a will, there is a way.
Yeah. That's true. If there's money, there's a way. Yeah. So we did these interviews, but the point of them was not to get a representative sample. What we wanted to do was just to talk to people in the way we'd talk to each other as colleagues, and just get more people into the conversation. Because we're always testing our ideas in seminars, testing our ideas, just talking to people and the friends, non-academic friends, but mostly of the same type of social class and background. So we wanted to expand to others and get some ideas. So for example, in Hamburg, one of the questions we asked most people, I think, was, what would you do if you were mayor for the day? And there were two older women in Hamburg who were being interviewed together. I don't know why they were together. And one of them said, well, more daycare. Of course, you need more daycare. And the other one, who was older, said, don't forget night care. And I've never heard that before. In all the time.
What does night care mean?
Well, if you think about women who work nights, nurses, for example. So it had never occurred to me. What do nurses
Who work night shifts.
Who work night shifts?
Okay.
What do they do with their children?
Yeah, my mom was a nurse.
Did she work night shifts?
Yeah.
Who looked after you?
My father or my grandma.
Yeah, so you were lucky that your grandma was around, your father was around.
Or my aunt or some relatives.
Yep, so that is the old way.
Yeah.
But that's not what happens in cities now, because people are not living with their families.
Mm-hmm.
Or, and there's a lot of single parents now.
Okay.
So what happens to their kids? So you just can't do that job.
No, that's really a good point. So what happens?
What happens, right? And this is not part of social policy anywhere.
Exactly.
Then later on, we found it had been a demand of the 1960s feminists to have 24-hour nurseries. But that was mostly, these were middle-class women who wanted a night out. It wasn't about having nurseries for...
Which is legitimate.
That's also legitimate. I agree. So we learnt some things in Berlin. One of our questions was, are there parts of the city where people don't feel comfortable going? And so we thought this might be related to race or social class, that there may be shopping centres that poor people can't go to, or the other way around, that rich people don't want to go to poor parts of town. Anyway, this woman said, oh, yes. I dress very conservatively in Berlin. And so there are these hipster streets that I just wouldn't go in because I feel so uncomfortable there. And we thought this was amazing, because the people in those streets probably think of themselves as the most right-on, inclusive people in the world. So if someone works in very conservative clothes,
mm-hmm.
they'll make them feel uncomfortable, deliberately or not. So we just got these things that we wouldn't have necessarily thought of, just to add to the richness of the picture. And we have lots of examples around public transport, for example, particularly in South America. Not in Rio, but we went to a conference in Sao Paulo, and people saying it's routine for mostly women to have a 3.5-hour commute each way for their jobs, and often it's a standing commute. So they're standing for 7 hours and then doing maybe a cleaning job, and the jobs start very early in the morning, so they get up at 3:30,
mm-hmm.
and they're getting 3 or 4 hours sleep and looking after their kids. Right?
Yeah.
And so this is not good for anything.
But you also mention in the book that people appreciate, which goes directly against the, at least we are having this conversation after the European elections, where the far right made a significant gains and success in variety of European countries. But you mentioned in the book that one of the things people appreciated when talking about social equality is diversity.
Yes.
Which came to me as maybe as a pleasant surprise.
Well,
were you surprised?
So it may be the particular cities we were looking at. So
when I say diversity, I mean cultural diversity or ethnic, national, religious, racial. So it includes
the people
everything.
we interviewed, on the whole, liked the idea of living in, one of the interviewees called it a city of many flavors, which we like that idea. And it's almost literally true, because people like food, like all sorts of different types of food. Maybe not in Italy, say you can only eat Italian food in Italy, but in other parts of the world, people like to have different types of food around, and different types of cultural expression as well. And I think, so I need to look at the details of the elections, but when I have looked at it, and this is not in detail, cities are much more tolerant of diversity than other regions and countries. So it's one of the paradoxical things that comes up. This is not universal, but one of the paradoxical things that often comes up is that people who live in diverse areas are much more tolerant of immigration than people who don't. So people who don't actually face anything,
they vote the anti-migration, right?
So the anti-migration people very often don't see a migrant.
They're not in touch with.
Or if they do, I mean, I can remember a radio program with someone who was working in a factory who was anti-immigration, and she was then asked about, well, who are you just working with British people? And he said, oh no. Next to me on one side is a lovely Nigerian woman, and on the other side is a lovely woman from Thailand, and we, children play together or something. And said, well, how can you be anti-immigration if like that? I said, well, no, these are just lovely people. It's the others, the flooding of people coming in. And of course, if you're with lots of people from different sides, it doesn't bother you so much. So I think one thing that really comes out quite strongly for us, and maybe we didn't emphasize this enough in the book, but on reflection, is on the whole, people just want to get on with their lives. They want their kids to have nice places to play. They want to have decent income. They want to have, decent income, to do the things they need to do, buy the things they need to buy. They want to live among friendly, cooperative neighborhood. They want to be able to go out to exercise in the countryside a bit and look at beautiful things. They also want to live in lively places. And most people are not very political. They just want to get by. Mm-hmm. And they tend to treat the economic system as just a backdrop to their lives rather than something they have any agency over. And so, if you're living in a capitalist society, you just take that for granted. That's how you get money. You go and you get a job. And then you try to do the best you can within that parameter. And what we did was we talked about our own ideas, and then we did a literature review. We did the interviews, and it was an iterative process. We were doing this over several years. We didn't mean to, but it just got delayed, and then there was COVID and so on. So we had lots of time to reflect on what we were doing. So over time, we just developed this view. I think we started with the view, really, that a city of equals is one that gives everyone a secure sense of belonging. So if you feel you belong there, and we developed a slogan, and we don't know where we got this from. It might have been an interview, it might have been out of our heads. But the slogan is, in a city of equals, I'm proud of my city, and my city is proud of people like me. That is, they don't want to get rid of people who look like me or have my background. And of course, many cities do want to get rid of a category of people. And if that's true, then it's not a city of equals. Then we boil it down to 4 parameters or values or core ideas. So the first one is non-market access to goods and services. So this is quite important. There have to be ways in which you can spend your time, which...
Yeah, we touched upon a bit.
Yeah, without spending money. And so that makes income inequality much less important. So if you live in a society where everything you do you have to buy, so there are some countries like this where there's just nowhere to go unless you've got money. Mm-hmm. So even if you want to go and play snooker or pool or something, it's very expensive to go to the pool hall. Maybe it's too hot to hang around outside, so you need to be indoors somewhere, so you have to be buying drink or food or something. Whereas if there's public libraries, other types of public spaces we've talked about, if there are free concerts in the park, if you're on the beach or waterfront and you go there without paying, you can play tennis cheaply or swim cheaply, take your kids for a picnic without having to worry about paying to go to a nice park. These are all things that can allow you to live a good life.
Yeah, actually the infrastructure develops a habit.
Yeah.
It's not the other way around.
Yeah. Well, that's true. That is true. If the opportunities are there,
it's more likely that you will develop this habit, because low-income people usually don't have that habit.
Well, that is true. But it depends where they're from. So it's quite interesting. So if people from Portugal are very good at barbecuing outside, eating outside, wherever they are in the world. They seem to
playing football at the beach.
Yeah. So there's some people who know how to enjoy themselves even without much money.
That's true.
And other people who don't. So that maybe it's acquired in a certain context. But you're right that people don't necessarily use the facilities. That is true. And other things have to be done for that. But a second thing we talked about is a sense of a meaningful life. So whatever your conception of the good is, whatever your preferences are, as long as they're not harmful to other people, you should be able to do this. So the type of example we're thinking about, can a gay couple walk down the street hand in hand? And more and more cities they can. In my childhood in England, actually might almost have gone to jail, I think, for doing that. So same-sex among men was illegal until the late 60s. So, but now it's unbelievable to see how far we've come in terms of gay marriage. So that type of thing, being able to live your life, whatever it is. And the third one we've touched on, diversity and social mixing. And this is quite interesting. So I was talking to people in the museum sector. And of course, the museum sector can do a lot about diversity and put on exhibitions from racial minorities or any type of segment of the society. The question is, who comes to those exhibitions? And typically, there are the people like me. So it's people 5 years either side or 10 years either side of retirement who go to these exhibitions, and people from the group who are represented. And those are the people, or art students. So those are the people who go to museums. So yes, the opportunities are there, but we haven't really got the proper social mixing because we haven't got the appreciation of other festivals. So a group, the Nigerian community put on a food festival. If only Nigerians go to it, okay, that's better than it not happening. But that's not why we would have wanted to have something like that from the city's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the third idea, diversity and social mixing. The fourth one we call non-deferential inclusion. And this is quite a clumsy name for a simple idea. And I'm actually rather pleased we gave it a clumsy name because we have to explain it and then people have to think about it. But the idea is that...
non-discriminatory?
Non-discriminatory, yeah. Well, we call it non-deferential because quite often... So imagine you are an immigrant, but you're entitled to public housing and you put your name down on the list and your name comes up. And you go to the office.
Under condition that there is a public housing.
Well, okay. As soon as public housing. Yeah, which is, yes, okay. So this is just an example. Might be a fictional example.
Yeah.
But imagine your term comes up. Now, how do they treat you when you go? So one possibility is they just treat you like they treat everyone else. And so they sit down and say, congratulations, you've got the house. It's a lovely house, blah, blah, blah. Here are your keys. Hope you'll be very happy. Another attitude is to be much more grudging about it and to say, well, these really are only meant to go to indigenous people or something, but your name came up, so here it is, and make you feel that you've had a special privilege for it, not treated like other people.
But do you know about any practices in the UK or anywhere else where this is not the case, where discrimination actually happens?
Discrimination actually happens.
Yeah.
Well, I think people in public offices now are much better at not discriminating.
I mean, legally they shouldn't do it, but
But there are other ways in which it happens. So, one of the places I like to observe this, not as often as I used to, is in bars, and who gets served first at a bar. So, in my youth, it would always be the tall white man who got served first.
Is it more important that he is white or that he is tall?
He's a man, and he's tall.
Okay.
In my youth, there weren't so many non-white people around, and probably now the male versus black or white, I think, is probably less true. But now, I just don't see this discrimination. So I see the bar staff on the whole just know who is next. They're keeping an eye out, they'll say who's next, and people will say who it is. But certainly 20 years ago, if I was at a bar with female friends, I would go to the bar, even if it was with their money, because there was much more chance that I would get served than they would. And it wasn't. I don't think it was explicit discrimination. It was just this idea that these are the people you serve first. Okay, more thrusting, they're throwing their money forward, or whatever it is. So these ways in which. So another example, and this is more of a fictional example, but when I was doing some work on poverty, I was looking at a survey called Breadline Britain, and they want to work out the idea of relative poverty, and so they need to know what are counted as essentials in your society. And what they do, they just have a list and they ask people, and if 50% say it's essential, they count it as essential. That's a methodology. So number one would be a good meal a day or something. Or maybe 2 meals a day, a dry, warm bed to sleep in, warm. We're talking about Britain, warm winter overcoat, and then I think number 4 on the list in one of the studies was being able to visit friends and family in hospital. And this amazed me, really, because I would never have thought about that. But as soon as it's mentioned, it just seems right. This is a real basic need. It goes back to relational equality or community or even family. So then we've heard about the example. So often for poorer people, it's harder to visit hospitals because limited visiting times. If you're working in a factory, your working hours can't get off it. Whereas middle class people, you can normally take a few hours off, and your boss understands, right? And you can make up the time some other time if you need to. So we imagine a case where someone's working in this way, they can't get to the hospital in normal visiting time. How are they treated? So one way in which it could be done is the boss says, well, I'm sorry, you just have to work these hours, and the hospital says, I'm sorry, it's the same rules for everyone. But you could imagine a situation where the boss says, well, look, for this next week, I'll allow you some time off, or you can do flexible hours, or the hospital can say, okay, we know you can't visit, so we'll make an exception for you. And so there the thought is, people may have the same rights, but their needs means they might need different things in order to be able to achieve their rights. So we think non-deferential inclusion means making those accommodations so that everyone can have what they're entitled to, rather than saying, I'm sorry, it's the same rules for everyone. It doesn't, it's no one's fault, but you can't do it, versus making an effort so it can be. So we think a city of equals does this sort of thing as well.
That's a good way for the system to accommodate to the needs of people and not vice versa.
Yes, exactly. So that relates actually to work I was doing before on disability. So I've been very influenced, you might be able to tell, by the social model of disability that says that instead of saying if you're disabled, that's a medical problem, that's your problem, what you say is, okay, you have a mobility problem. How can we design the environment so you can get around just as well as everyone else? So we call it our problem as from the center rather than your problem. So we try to make the environment accommodating to everyone rather than making special arrangements for each individual. It's not always possible, of course, but just as a bit of ideal theory, it can be very helpful.
It makes absolutely sense. We had some more topics to discuss. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but thank you so much for being our guest.
It's absolutely my pleasure. And yes, we could have gone on for another few hours probably.
Maybe next time you come to Belgrade.
Next time.
Hopefully.
Thank you so much.